"I'm carrying your husband's child," my daughter-in-law whispered to me at the dinner table, as if she were asking me to pass the salt. I didn't drop my fork. I didn't raise my voice. I smiled. The kind of smile that comes from a place so still, so quiet, that no one else at that table could hear what had just shattered. The dining room looked exactly as it always did. Mahogany table polished to a soft shine, warm yellow light from the chandelier, the faint scent of rosemary from the roasted chicken I had spent 2 hours preparing. My son Daniel sat across from me, scrolling through his phone between bites, barely glancing up. My husband Richard poured himself another glass of wine, his movements calm, practiced. And Vanessa, my daughter-in-law, sat beside him, her hand resting lightly on the edge of the table, her nails perfectly manicured, her posture relaxed. Too relaxed. As if she had already claimed a seat that did not belong to her. I reached for my glass of water and took a slow sip, letting the coolness steady me. No one else had heard her. Of course they hadn't. She had leaned in just enough, her voice soft, controlled, deliberate. This wasn't a confession. It was a message. I set my glass down carefully, making sure it didn't clink against the table. "Everything okay?" Richard asked, finally looking at me. His eyes searched my face for something, concern perhaps or suspicion, but he found nothing. I gave a small nod. "Just tired," I said, my voice even, almost gentle. He seemed satisfied with that. They always were. For years I had been the one who kept things together. The one who hosted the dinners, remembered the birthdays, smoothed over the awkward silences. I had built this home into something warm, something stable. And now, sitting at that same table, I realized I had been the only one who believed in it. Vanessa leaned back in her chair, her lips curling into a faint smile as she picked up her fork again. She didn't look at me this time. She didn't need to. She thought she had already won. I watched the two of them, Richard and Vanessa, without moving my head, only my eyes shifting slightly, quietly. The way he avoided looking at her directly. The way she didn't need him to. There was an understanding between them now, something silent. And practiced. And Daniel, my son. He laughed at something on his phone, completely unaware, or perhaps choosing to be. I couldn't tell which was worse. I folded my napkin neatly beside my plate, even though I wasn't finished eating. My hands were steady. That surprised me. I had imagined in other moments of my life that betrayal would feel like a storm, loud, violent, impossible to contain. But this was something else. This was quiet, cold, precise. I glanced at Vanessa again just for a second. She caught my eye this time, and for a brief moment, there it was, a flicker of something sharp, almost triumphant. She wanted a reaction. She wanted me to break. I gave her nothing. Instead I smiled again. Softer this time. Almost kind. And that was the moment she made her first real mistake. Because what she didn't understand, what neither of them understood, was that I had spent my entire life learning how to endure in silence. And silence, when used correctly, is not weakness. It is preparation. I picked up my fork again, cut a small piece of chicken, and placed it carefully in my mouth, as if this were just another ordinary evening. But inside something had shifted. Not broken. Not shattered. Shifted. Like a lock turning into place. And as the conversation around the table continued, mundane, effortless, empty, I realized something with absolute clarity. This dinner had not been the beginning of my humiliation. It had been the beginning of their ending. The night did not end when the plates were cleared. It lingered in the quiet spaces of the house, in the soft hum of the refrigerator, in the slow ticking of the clock on the wall. I stood alone at the kitchen sink, rinsing dishes that no one had really tasted, letting the warm water run over my hands longer than necessary. The rest of the house had settled into its usual rhythm. Daniel had gone upstairs, his footsteps heavy but distracted. Richard remained in the living room, the low murmur of the television filling the air, a familiar sound that now felt strangely distant. Vanessa had excused herself early, claiming a headache, her voice light, almost rehearsed. I dried my hands carefully and placed the dish towel back on its hook, aligning it so the edges were straight. Small things mattered. They always had. I turned off the kitchen light and paused in the doorway, looking out toward the hallway that led to the bedrooms. For a moment, everything appeared unchanged. The same walls, the same photographs, the same quiet order I had maintained for decades. But something underneath had shifted, like a foundation that had cracked without a sound. I walked slowly down the hall, my steps measured, my breathing steady. As I passed the guest room, I noticed the door was slightly open. A faint light spilled into the hallway. I stopped not because I needed to, but because something inside me told me to pay attention. I did not push the door open. I did not need to. Instead, I continued walking, reaching my own bedroom and closing the door gently behind me. The room felt different. Not empty, not unfamiliar, but altered in a way that could not be undone. I sat at the edge of the bed and looked around, taking in the details I had once found comforting. The framed photo on the dresser. The neatly folded blanket at the foot of the bed. The faint scent of lavender from the diffuser I had turned on earlier that evening. I picked up my phone and stared at the screen for a long moment before unlocking it. My hands did not shake. That surprised me again. Instead, there was a clarity I had not felt in years. A quiet understanding that what had happened tonight was not sudden. It had been building. Piece by piece. I opened my messages, scrolling through weeks, then months, noticing the gaps, the short replies, the moments I had dismissed as busyness or distraction. I thought about the evenings Richard had come home later than usual, offering simple explanations that I had accepted without question. I thought about Vanessa lingering in the kitchen after everyone else had left, her laughter just a little too easy, her presence just a little too comfortable. And I thought about myself, about how I had chosen not to see it. Not because I was blind, but because I believed in something that no longer existed. I set my phone down on the nightstand and leaned back slightly, resting my hands in my lap. There were no tears. No sudden rush of anger. Only a slow, steady awareness that settled into place like a final piece of a puzzle. I had spent years building a life around people who had quietly rewritten their roles within it. And tonight they had finally said it out loud. Not to the room. Not to the family. But to me. I closed my eyes for a brief moment, then opened them again, focusing on the reflection of myself in the mirror across the room. I looked the same posture, the same calm expression. But I knew with absolute certainty that I was no longer standing in the same life I had walked into that morning. I reached for the lamp beside the bed and turned it off, letting the room fall into darkness. And in that quiet I made a decision. I would not confront them. Not yet. Because what they believed about me was their greatest weakness. They thought I would react. They thought I would break. They thought tonight was the end of my place in this family. They were wrong. Tonight was the moment I began to see everything clearly. And once you see clearly, you do not rush. You prepare. The next morning arrived without ceremony. No storm. No raised voices. Just the quiet, ordinary light of early sunlight filtering through the kitchen window, casting soft lines across the countertop I had wiped clean the night before. I woke at 6, as I always did, my body still loyal to routines that no longer held the same meaning. For a moment, lying there, I let myself feel nothing. Not confusion. Not pain. Just stillness. Then I sat up, placed my feet on the floor, and began the day as if nothing had changed. Because outwardly nothing had. I made coffee the same way I had for years, measuring 2 scoops, filling the machine with water, pressing the button and waiting for that familiar steady drip. The sound grounded me. I stood there, hands resting lightly on the counter, watching the dark liquid fill the glass pot, and I realized something important. The world does not pause for betrayal. It continues. And so would I. I poured a cup, added a small amount of cream, stirred it slowly, and took a sip. The taste was the same. Warm. Slightly bitter. Predictable. I appreciated that. Predictability was something I would use now, not trust. Footsteps echoed faintly from upstairs. Daniel, most likely, moving through his morning routine without a second thought about the foundation beneath him. A few minutes later, I heard Richard's door open, followed by the low murmur of his voice as he greeted the day like any other. I did not look up. I did not call out. Instead, I reached for my phone again, this time with purpose. I opened my calendar and began scrolling backward. Not weeks, but months. I noted the days Richard had been out late. I marked the weekends Vanessa had stayed longer than usual. I traced patterns I had once ignored, and now they aligned too easily. There was a rhythm to it. A structure. This had not been careless. It had been managed, planned. I set my coffee down and opened a different application, one I had not used in years. Our shared household accounts. I scrolled through transactions, my eyes moving calmly, deliberately. Small things stood out first. A charge at a restaurant I had never been to. A purchase for a hotel reservation on a night Richard claimed he had worked late. Then larger patterns began to emerge. Transfers I did not recognize. Payments that had been labeled in ways meant to appear ordinary. I did not rush. I did not react. I simply observed. The truth does not need to be chased when it has already been living in your home. It reveals itself when you are finally ready to see it. I closed the application and set the phone down, then reached for a notepad and a pen from the drawer. I wrote down dates, times, locations. Not because I needed proof for myself, but because I understood something they did not. Truth becomes power when it is organized. The sound of footsteps grew closer. Richard entered the kitchen, his tie slightly loose, his expression calm. "You are up early," he said, reaching for a mug. I gave a small nod. "Could not sleep," I replied, my tone neutral. He poured himself coffee, standing only a few feet away from me, close enough that I could see the familiar lines of his face, the same face I had trusted for decades. There was no hesitation in him, no sign that anything had changed. That, more than anything, confirmed what I needed to know. Vanessa appeared moments later, her hair neatly styled, her movements light, almost cheerful. She greeted Richard first, then Daniel, who followed behind her. When she finally looked at me, her smile was polite, measured, as if we shared a secret she believed I was too weak to hold. I returned the smile, just as measured, just as calm. And in that quiet exchange, without a single word spoken, I made my next decision. I would not ask questions. I would not seek explanations, because explanations are given to those who are uncertain. And I was no longer uncertain. I picked up my coffee, took another sip, and listened as they talked around me, their voices blending into a familiar, empty rhythm. They believed they were moving forward. They believed they had already rewritten the story. But they had forgotten one simple truth. I had been the one writing it all along. By mid-morning, the house had settled into a quiet that felt almost staged, as if every room was holding its breath and waiting to see what I would do next. I moved through it slowly, not wandering but observing. The living room, with its carefully arranged furniture, looked exactly as it had the day before. The same throw blanket folded over the arm of the couch, the same framed photographs lining the shelves. Smiling faces. Holidays. Anniversaries. Moments I had once believed were permanent. I paused in front of one frame in particular, a photo taken 10 years ago at the lake house. Richard stood beside me, his arm around my shoulders, Daniel on my other side, younger, still looking at me with something that resembled certainty. I studied that image for a moment longer than necessary, then set it back in place with deliberate care. It was not the memory that had changed. It was the meaning attached to it. I continued down the hallway, stopping briefly outside the guest room again. The door was closed this time. Perfectly closed. No light. No sign of anything out of place. I reached for the handle, then stopped myself before my fingers made contact. There was no need. I already knew enough. Instead, I turned away and walked toward my study, a room I had not used with intention in years. It had always been there, quiet, organized, waiting. Much like me. I opened the door and stepped inside, closing it gently behind me. The air carried a faint scent of paper and polished wood. My desk sat exactly as I had left it, clean, orderly, almost untouched. I pulled out the chair and sat down, placing both hands flat against the surface. For a moment I did nothing. Then I opened the drawer on the right and removed a folder I had not looked at in a long time. Inside were documents I had once reviewed out of habit, not necessity. Property records, account summaries, legal agreements, the architecture of a life built over decades. I flipped through them slowly, my eyes scanning each page with a clarity I had not possessed before. Names, signatures, ownership structures. Details that had once felt like background noise now stood out with sharp precision. I noticed where my name appeared, where it did not, where things had been adjusted over time quietly without discussion. Not enough to raise alarm, just enough to shift balance. I set the papers down and reached for my phone, scrolling through my contacts until I found a name I had not called in years. Margaret Hayes. My attorney. I did not press the call button right away. Instead, I looked at the name for a few seconds, considering the weight of what that call would mean. Not emotionally. Practically. Once certain steps are taken, they cannot be undone. But then again, neither could what had already been done to me. I placed the phone back on the desk without calling. Not yet. Timing mattered. Precision mattered more. I picked up a pen and began writing again. This time not just dates and transactions but questions. Direct. Specific. Strategic. What had been transferred? When? Under whose authority? What could still be secured? What could not? My handwriting remained steady, each word placed carefully, as if I were drafting something far more significant than a list. I was drafting control. Control over a situation they believed had already slipped from my hands. A soft knock sounded somewhere down the hall, followed by Vanessa's voice, light and casual, calling out to Daniel. I listened without moving, my pen hovering just above the paper. Her tone carried no fear. No hesitation. Only confidence. The kind that comes from believing the outcome is already decided. I allowed myself the smallest exhale, not of frustration but of understanding. People reveal their intentions most clearly when they believe no one is watching. And now I was watching everything. I finished the last line on the page, set the pen down, and closed the folder with quiet finality. Then I reached for my phone again, this time without hesitation, and opened my calendar. I selected a date. 2 days from now. Enough time to prepare. Not enough time for them to notice anything had changed. I scheduled a meeting. Not with emotion. With purpose. And as I sat there in the stillness of that room, I realized something that settled deeper than anything else had so far. They thought this was a secret they controlled. But secrets, once uncovered, do not belong to the ones who created them. They belong to the one who decides when to reveal them. I left the study only after everything on that desk had been returned to its exact place, every paper aligned, every drawer closed with quiet precision, as if nothing had been disturbed, because that was the point, nothing about me could look disturbed, not yet. The house greeted me with the same soft silence as before, but now I moved through it with intention, not habit. I could hear Vanessa's voice faintly from the kitchen, light and casual, the kind of tone people use when they believe they are safe. I slowed my steps just slightly as I approached, not to listen in, but to observe without being seen. She stood by the counter, her phone in hand, speaking in a low voice. "He has no idea," she said, followed by a small laugh, the kind that carried confidence, not fear. I did not need to hear the rest. I stepped into the kitchen deliberately, making my presence known. She turned immediately, her expression shifting into something polite, controlled. "Good morning," she said, as if the previous night had been nothing more than an ordinary dinner. I gave a small nod and walked past her, reaching for a glass, filling it with water, my reflection faintly visible in the window above the sink, calm, composed, unreadable. "You slept okay?" she asked, her tone almost thoughtful, as if she were testing something. I turned slightly toward her, just enough to meet her eyes. "Better than expected," I replied, and held her gaze for a second longer than necessary, just enough to let her wonder. Then I looked away. That was all it took. Uncertainty does not need words. It only needs a pause and expectation. She said nothing after that, and I could feel it, the smallest shift in her posture, barely noticeable but real. I left the kitchen without another word and walked toward the front door, picking up my coat and my bag, routine movements, nothing rushed, nothing dramatic. Heading out. Daniel called from the living room. I glanced in his direction. He was sitting on the couch, half watching the television, half distracted by his phone. "Just a few errands," I said, my voice steady. He nodded without much interest, and I stepped outside into the cool morning air. The sunlight was brighter now, sharper. It felt different against my skin, not comforting but clarifying. I walked to my car, unlocked it, and sat behind the wheel for a moment before starting the engine. My hands rested lightly on the steering wheel, steady, controlled. I was not leaving to escape, I was leaving to act. The drive into town was quiet, familiar roads passing by in a sequence I had known for years. But today I noticed details I had not paid attention to before. The timing of the traffic lights, the pattern of the intersections, the way everything moved in predictable order. Predictability was not weakness, it was structure, and structure could be used. I parked in front of a small office Building with a modest sign near the entrance, nothing impressive, nothing that would draw attention. Exactly what I needed. I stepped inside, the air cool, the scent of paper and polished surfaces familiar. The receptionist looked up and offered a polite smile. "Good morning," she said. "Do you have an appointment?" I returned the smile, calm and measured. "Yes," I replied, "I do." And as I stood there waiting to be called in, I realized something with complete certainty. This was no longer about what they had done. It was about what I would do next, and unlike them, I was not improvising. I was following a plan they did not even know existed. Margaret Hayes did not waste time with pleasantries, and that was one of the reasons I had trusted her years ago. She looked at me across her desk with a steady, assessing expression, the kind that did not react to emotion but measured facts. "It has been a while, Eleanor," she said, her voice calm, professional. I returned a small nod and placed my folder on the desk between us, aligning it carefully before opening it. "I will need your discretion," I said, not as a request, but as a statement of expectation. She gave a slight nod, already understanding more than I had said. I slid the first document toward her, then the next, each page placed with intention, not hurried, not scattered, organized. She reviewed them in silence, her eyes moving methodically across the lines, occasionally pausing, occasionally marking something with her pen. The room remained quiet except for the faint sound of paper shifting. I watched her, not with anxiety but with focus. This was not a moment for doubt, it was a moment for clarity. After several minutes, she set the papers down and looked at me directly. "You are correct to come now," she said, her tone unchanged. "There have been adjustments, gradual but significant." I did not ask what that meant. I already knew. Instead, I asked the only question that mattered. "What remains under my control?" She folded her hands on the desk, considering her answer carefully. "More than they expect," she said, and for the first time that morning I allowed myself a small, almost invisible shift in breath, not relief, not satisfaction, just confirmation. She continued, outlining steps, legal boundaries, timelines, each detail precise, each option measured. I listened without interrupting, absorbing everything, not reacting, not rushing. When she finished, she leaned back slightly. "You will need to decide how far you want to go," she said. I held her gaze steady. "Far enough," I replied, and that was all that needed to be said. She gave a small nod and began preparing documents, efficient, focused, as if this were any other case. But it was not. This was not about conflict. This was about restoration of control, of position, of truth. I signed where she indicated, each signature placed with care, not as a reaction, but as a decision. When it was done, she gathered the papers and closed the folder. "I will handle the filings," she said. "You should proceed as normal." I stood, smoothing my coat. "I always do," I replied, and left without hesitation. Outside, the air felt different again, sharper, more defined, as if the world had adjusted slightly to accommodate the clarity I now carried. I returned to my car and sat for a moment before starting the engine, my reflection faint in the windshield, calm, composed, unchanged to anyone else, but entirely different to myself. The drive home was uneventful, familiar streets, familiar turns, everything moving as it always had. But now I understood something with complete certainty. Routine is the perfect cover for preparation. When I pulled into the driveway, the house looked exactly the same as when I had left, quiet, orderly, unchanged. I stepped inside, placing my keys in their usual spot, removing my coat, hanging it carefully. The sound of voices drifted from the living room, light conversation, casual, unaware. I walked in slowly, not announcing myself, simply appearing as I always had. Richard glanced up briefly, offering a small, distracted smile. Daniel remained focused on his phone, and Vanessa looked at me, just for a moment, her eyes searching for something, a crack, a shift, a sign that her words from the night before had taken root. I gave her none. I moved past them, toward the kitchen, reaching for a glass, filling it with water, the same movements, the same rhythm, but now, every step I took carried something they could not see, something already in motion. They believed time was on their side. They believed they had already secured the future they wanted. But time does not belong to those who act first, it belongs to those who act with precision. And as I stood there, listening to their voices blend into the background, I understood that everything from this moment forward would unfold exactly as it needed to, not because of chance but because I had chosen it. The next 2 days passed exactly as they expected them to, and that was precisely why they mattered. Nothing in my routine changed, not in a way anyone could point to. I woke at the same hour, prepared meals with the same care, responded to conversations with the same measured tone. I moved through the house as if I were still the woman they believed me to be, the one who noticed everything but questioned nothing. The one who held things together quietly, predictably, reliably, and in that predictability they relaxed. I could see it in small ways, in the way Richard no longer avoided certain conversations, in the way Vanessa's confidence settled more comfortably into her posture, in the way Daniel remained untouched by anything beneath the surface, unaware or unwilling to see. Each of them played their roles as if the outcome had already been decided, and I allowed it, because certainty is the easiest thing to dismantle. On the second evening, Vanessa suggested dinner again, her tone casual, almost cheerful. "We should all sit down tonight," she said, glancing between Richard and Daniel. "It has been a while since we actually talked." I agreed without hesitation, a simple nod, no resistance, no curiosity, and I saw it, just for a fraction of a second, the flicker of satisfaction in her eyes. She believed she was guiding the moment, shaping it, setting the stage. What she did not understand was that I had already accepted the invitation long before she spoke it. That night, I set the table with the same precision as always, the plates aligned, the silverware placed evenly, the glasses polished until they caught the light just right. Small details, but they mattered, because control is often expressed in the things others overlook. Dinner began as it always did, light conversation, familiar rhythms, the quiet clink of utensils against plates. I listened more than I spoke, observing, measuring, waiting. Richard discussed something about work. Daniel responded with half attention, and Vanessa watched me, not constantly, but often enough to reveal her focus. She was waiting for something, perhaps a reaction, perhaps a question, perhaps the moment she believed would confirm her control. I gave her none of it. Instead, I maintained the same calm presence, the same steady tone, until the conversation shifted, almost naturally, almost as if it had been rehearsed. Vanessa set her fork down and leaned back slightly, her hand resting lightly against her side, her expression composed, deliberate. "There is something we should talk about," she said, her voice soft, but clear enough to carry across the table. Daniel looked up, mildly curious. Richard remained still, too still. I placed my napkin beside my plate and looked at her, not with surprise, not with concern, but with quiet attention, giving her exactly what she thought she wanted. "Space," she continued, explaining, choosing her words carefully, presenting her version of events as if it were something to be understood rather than questioned. I listened without interruption, my expression unchanged, my posture steady, and as she spoke I realized something important. She believed this moment belonged to her. She believed she was revealing something, introducing something, controlling something, but she was only stepping into a moment that had already been prepared. When she finished, the room fell into a brief silence, the kind that usually invites reaction, explanation, emotion. I let it linger just long enough, then I reached for my glass, took a slow sip of water, and set it back down with quiet precision. "I see," I said, my voice calm, almost gentle, and in that moment something shifted, not in me, but in them, because they had expected resistance or confusion, or even denial, but not understanding, not acceptance, not this. And as their certainty faltered even slightly, I knew we had arrived exactly where I needed us to be, not at the beginning of their plan, but at the edge of mine. No one spoke immediately after I said those two simple words, and that silence was not empty. It was heavy, uncertain, unfamiliar to them. I could see it in the way Daniel shifted slightly in his seat, his eyes moving between Vanessa and Richard as if trying to understand something that had not been explained to him. Richard reached for his glass but did not drink, his fingers resting against it as though he had forgotten what he intended to do. And Vanessa held her posture, but her confidence no longer sat as comfortably as it had before. There was a pause in her breathing, almost imperceptible, but it was there. I let the moment stretch just long enough for them to feel it. Then I reached beside me and picked up a thin folder I had placed on the chair earlier, unnoticed, exactly where I needed it to be. I set it on the table with a soft, controlled motion, not dramatic, not forceful, just enough to draw attention. "Since we are talking openly," I said, my voice calm, measured, "I thought it would be appropriate to clarify a few things as well." Daniel frowned slightly, confusion beginning to surface. "What things?" he asked, his tone uncertain. I did not look at him immediately. Instead, I opened the folder and slid a single page across the table toward Richard. "You should start with this," I said. He hesitated, then picked it up, his eyes scanning the document quickly at first, then more slowly, his expression tightening in a way that confirmed he understood exactly what he was reading. Vanessa leaned slightly forward, trying to see, her earlier composure now replaced with something sharper, more alert. "What is that?" she asked, but I did not answer her. Not yet. I allowed Richard the time to process, because realization, when it comes quietly, is far more effective than accusation. He looked up at me, something unsettled in his gaze. Eleanor, he began, but I raised my hand gently, not to interrupt but to pause him. There is more, I said, and slid another document across the table, this one toward Vanessa. She picked it up quickly, too quickly, her eyes moving across the page, her expression shifting with each line. The certainty she had carried into this room now unraveling in small, visible increments. Daniel leaned forward, his voice sharper now. Can someone tell me what is going on? I turned to him then, meeting his eyes fully for the first time that evening. I am, I said simply, then returned my attention to the table, to the documents, to the structure I had put in place. Over the past few months, I continued, my tone even almost conversational. There have been changes made to financial accounts, property interests, and legal designations. I spoke clearly, not rushing, not emphasizing, just stating. Some of those changes were done without my knowledge, others were done with the assumption that I would not notice. I let that settle for a moment, watching as Daniel's confusion deepened, as Richard's discomfort sharpened, as Vanessa's confidence continued to fade. What you did not account for, I said, placing my hand lightly on the folder, is that I do notice eventually. Vanessa set the paper down, her fingers tightening slightly against the table. This does not change anything, she said, her voice controlled but no longer steady. I looked at her then, not with anger, not with accusation, but with clarity. It changes everything, I replied quietly, and in that moment the balance of the room shifted completely, not because I had raised my voice, not because I had revealed everything, but because I had revealed enough to show them that what they believed was secure had already been undone, enough to make them understand that this conversation was no longer theirs to control. And as I sat there, composed, deliberate, and entirely certain, I realized that the outcome they had been so confident in was no longer possible, not because I had stopped them, but because I had already moved beyond them. Daniel's chair scraped softly against the floor as he pushed himself upright, the sound cutting through the tension that had settled over the table. Someone needs to explain this right now, he said, his voice no longer distracted, no longer passive, but sharp with confusion and something else beginning to surface, something closer to realization. I did not rush to answer him. Instead, I folded my hands lightly in front of me, allowing the weight of everything already said to do its work. Richard remained seated, his shoulders slightly tense, his eyes no longer meeting mine but fixed somewhere on the table, as if the answers might rearrange themselves if he waited long enough. Vanessa, however, leaned forward, her composure thinning. This is unnecessary, she said, her tone controlled but edged. We were trying to be honest, and now you are turning this into something else. I looked at her steadily, not reacting to the words, only observing the shift beneath them. Honesty, I repeated quietly, letting the word settle between us, is not something that begins when it is convenient. She held my gaze for a moment, then looked away, just briefly, but it was enough. Daniel turned toward Richard, his voice lower now, more focused. Dad, what is she talking about? There was a pause, a long one, and in that silence I could see the truth forming in him before it was spoken. Richard exhaled slowly, but said nothing, and that silence answered more than any explanation could. I reached for the final document in the folder and placed it carefully at the center of the table, within everyone's view. This outlines the current status of all shared assets, I said, my tone even precise. It also reflects the changes that have already been filed as of this morning. Vanessa's head lifted sharply, her eyes scanning the page without touching it, as if proximity alone might change what was written there. Filed? She repeated, and for the first time her voice lost its control. I nodded once calmly. Yes, I said, filed. Daniel stepped closer, looking over the table, his expression tightening as he began to understand the scope of what had been done. Not just what had happened, but what had already been set in motion. You changed everything? He asked, not accusing. Not yet, but searching. I met his eyes, steady, unflinching. No, I replied. I protected what was mine. The distinction mattered, and he felt it. I could see it in the way he straightened slightly, as if adjusting to a reality he had not considered. Vanessa finally picked up the paper, her hands no longer as steady as they had been, her eyes moving quickly now, searching for something to hold on to, something that would return control to her. But there was nothing there for her to use. Nothing left unsecured, nothing left assumed. You cannot do this without telling us, she said, but the words lacked conviction. I tilted my head slightly, considering her statement as if it were a genuine question. I did not realize I needed permission to correct what was done without my knowledge. I replied, my voice calm, almost thoughtful. Richard finally looked up then, his expression more complicated now, not just discomfort, but something closer to understanding. Eleanor, he said. Quietly, but again I raised my hand, not to silence him, but to signal that this was no longer a conversation that required interruption. There is nothing left to explain, I said, not harshly, not coldly, but with finality. I stood then, slowly smoothing the front of my jacket, my movements unhurried, deliberate. The room remained still, as if no one was quite sure what to do next, and that was exactly as it should be. I gathered the folder, closing it with quiet precision, and looked at each of them in turn, not searching for reaction, not waiting for response, simply acknowledging what was now clear. You believed I would react, I said, my voice steady. You believed I would argue or plead or try to hold on to something that had already been taken from me. I paused, just briefly, letting the truth settle fully into the space between us. But I do not hold on to what has already been broken. I continued, I replace it. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of everything that had led to this moment. I turned then, walking toward the hallway with the same calm steps I had taken through this house for years. But this time there was nothing behind those steps except certainty. And as I reached the doorway, I understood something with complete clarity. They had thought they were rewriting my life, but in the end they had only given me the reason to take it back.